How Uber disrupted an entire industry in 5 years. It was a cold December night in Paris. The year was 2008. Two tech entrepreneurs couldn't get a cab, so they built a company that would make cabs nearly irrelevant. That company was Uber, and within 5 years it had spread to hundreds of cities, sparked riots from London to New Delhi, and permanently changed how billions of people move through the world. This is the story of how two people with a broken idea, a borrowed concept, and almost no money ignited one of the fastest corporate explosions in history, and what every person watching this can learn from it. Stay with me, because the Uber story is not just about taxis and apps. It's about timing, ruthlessness, regulatory arbitrage, and what happens when a startup decides the rules simply don't apply to them. Section 1. The Paris Moment and the Broken Idea. Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp were not nobodies. By 2008, Kalanick had already sold his company Red Swoosh to Akamai for $19 million after years of near bankruptcy. Camp had just sold StumbleUpon to eBay for $75 million. They were successful, but not yet legendary. At a tech conference in Paris in December 2008, the two men couldn't find a cab. It was snowing. Every cab was taken. And in that moment of frustration, Camp had a thought. What if you could tap a button on your phone and a car would just show up? The original idea wasn't even ride-sharing. It was a time-shared private car service, a black car you and your friends would split to reduce the cost of luxury transportation. The early prototype was called Uber Cab. It launched in San Francisco in 2010 with a fleet of exactly 3 cars. Here's the thing that almost everyone gets wrong about Uber's origin. It was not a particularly original idea. Several people had been experimenting with location-based car apps. The taxi industry itself had been looking at phone dispatching for years. What made Uber different was not the concept. It was the execution speed, the willingness to ignore every rule in the way, and the decision to raise money so aggressively that no competitor could keep up. By the end of 2010, Uber had raised $1.25 million from angel investors. By June 2011, Benchmark Capital led an $11 million Series A. The company was valued at $60 million. Within 18 months of its first car ride, Uber was worth more than some regional taxi companies had been worth in their entire history. Section 2. The Playbook. Launch fast, fight later. Uber's growth strategy had a pattern that repeated in every new city. Launch without permission, fight the regulators, win the public, and force the law to catch up. In city after city, Uber would arrive without notifying local taxi commissions. Drivers would sign up on the platform. Surge pricing would kick in on Friday nights. Suddenly, thousands of people who had been waiting 45 minutes for a cab were getting picked up in 8. They loved it. They told their friends. The city government would then try to shut Uber down. Uber would send an email to its user base asking riders to call their city council member. The calls would flood in. Regulators would back down. This was not an accident. Kalanick called it principled confrontation. He believed and stated publicly that Uber was not just a company, but a political campaign, and that its riders were its voters. Every time a government tried to push Uber out, Uber mobilized those riders like an army.
Between 2012 and 2015, Uber launched in over 300 cities across 58 countries. The growth curve was unlike anything the business world had seen. In 2013, the company processed $687 million in ride bookings. In 2014, that number jumped to $2.9 billion. In 2015, it crossed $10 billion. That's roughly a 15x increase in gross bookings in 2 years. The taxi industry had no answer. They tried lobbying, they tried litigation, they tried competing apps, most of which couldn't get traction because Uber was already everywhere and drivers had no reason to split their time between platforms. In some cities, taxi medallions, the licenses required to operate a cab, had been worth over $1 million each. Within a few years of Uber's arrival, those medallions lost most of their value. In New York City, a medallion that sold for $1.3 million in 2014 was worth under $100,000 by 2019. That is the fastest destruction of an established industry's capital base in modern American history. Section 3. The money. How they funded a war. None of this was cheap. Uber's expansion was funded by one of the most aggressive fundraising campaigns in startup history. The company raised money not just to grow, but to subsidize rides, deliberately operating at a loss in new markets to drive down prices, attract riders, and squeeze out competitors. In 2013, Google Ventures invested $258 million, valuing Uber at $3.76 billion. In 2014, Fidelity and BlackRock joined around, valuing the company at $18.2 billion. In 2015, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund wrote a check for $3.5 billion, one of the largest single venture investments in history at the time. By the time Uber prepared to go public, it had raised over $24 billion in venture capital and private equity. To put that in context, at the time of its IPO in May 2019, Uber had never made a profit, not in a single quarter. The company had lost $1.8 billion in 2018 alone. It was burning cash at a rate that would have killed any traditional business. But venture capital had decided that market dominance was worth more than near-term profit, and that if Uber could own enough of the global transportation market, the profits would eventually follow. That bet has been partially vindicated and partially complicated. Uber went public at $45 per share, below its expected range, in a disappointing IPO that valued the company at around $82 billion. The stock fell on its first day of trading. Investors who bought at the IPO price didn't break even for years. But the company did eventually turn profitable. In 2023, Uber posted its first full-year operating profit. Revenue hit $37.3 billion. The stock recovered significantly. By 2025, Uber had a market cap around $170 billion, more than Ford, General Motors, and every major American airline combined. Section 4. The chaos inside. The external story of Uber's rise is one of relentless expansion and regulatory warfare. The internal story is considerably darker. Travis Kalanick built a culture that worshipped growth above everything else. In 2017, a former Uber engineer named Susan Fowler published a blog post describing rampant sexual harassment, a broken HR system that protected high performers over victims, and a management philosophy she described as systematically discriminatory. The post went viral. Within weeks, dozens of other employees came forward with similar stories. An investigation by former Attorney General Holder produced a 13-page report with 47 recommendations. Shortly after the report was released, Kalanick resigned as CEO. He had built one of the most valuable companies in history. He had also built one of the most notoriously toxic workplaces in Silicon Valley, which is saying something.
Dara Khosrowshahi, the former CEO of Expedia, took over in August 2017. His job was essentially to make Uber safe enough to go public, to rebuild its relationship with regulators, clean up the culture, and prove that a company so long defined by rule-breaking could operate within normal corporate boundaries. By most measures, he succeeded. But it required admitting things Kalanick never would, that Uber had made mistakes, that drivers deserved better treatment, that working with governments was more sustainable than fighting them. The scrappy startup had grown up, or at least learned to act like it had.
Uber went from a Paris snowstorm to a $170 billion company in roughly 15 years. It cost billions of dollars, dozens of lawsuits, 2 CEOs, and an industry's worth of broken careers. It changed how cities move, how workers earn, and how startups think about regulation. Whether Uber is ultimately a force for good or a cautionary tale about unchecked ambition probably depends on where you're standing. If you're a tech entrepreneur, it's the ultimate proof of concept. If you're a former taxi driver who lost your livelihood, it's something else entirely. What's undeniable is that Uber rewrote the rules of how fast a company can grow and what that growth costs. If this story hit different, subscribe and hit the bell. Every week, we break down the stories behind the world's biggest companies and the financial strategies that made them possible. And drop a comment. Do you think Uber was net positive or net negative for the world? I genuinely want to know what you think. See you next week.